Welcome everyone to the Prairie Regional Adaptation Collaborative's webinar on managing the changing risk of wildfire on the Prairie region. I apologize for the late start. We have a bit of a technical issue, but we're getting that sorted. In the meantime, my name is Joellen Perry, and I'm the Director for Adaptation in Canada at the International Institute for Sustainable Development. And we serve as the secretariat for the Prac and are hosting this webinar today. If you're not familiar with it, the Prairies Regional Adaptation Collaborative, or the Prac, is a cost share program of the governments of Alberta, Manitoba, and Saskatchewan, and Natural Resources Canada. And it aims to increase capacity on the prairies to understand, prepare for, and take action to address the implications of our changing climate. The Prac has been hosting webinars since 2018 and focusing on highlighting and sharing the adaptation efforts on the prairies. So we've done webinars in the past around conserving biodiversity to build climate resilience, and the role of natural infrastructure in advancing adaptation to climate change. And if you're interested, those previous webinars are available on the Prac website. Today's webinar focuses on how fire risk on the prairies is projected to change and how different levels of government are currently working to reduce these risks and protect communities. We're going to begin today with an overview presentation by Mike Flanagan, Professor of Wildland Fire at the University of Alberta and Director of Canada Wildfire. He will speak about how wildfire risks in the prairie provinces and how these risks are projected to change. This will be followed by several case studies showing how municipalities are managing current and future wildfire risk. Our speakers today are Larry Fremont, with the Prevention Coordinator with the Saskatchewan Public Safety Agency, Cliff Buettner, Director of Forestry and Emergency Protective Services at the Prince Albert Grand Council, Pam Sanderson, with the Community of Napanak's Executive Coordinator of Emergency Preparedness, Fire Suppression, and Fire Smart Programs, and Shauna Quartz, Fire Control Officer with Manitoba Wildfire Service. There will be an opportunity to raise questions with all of our presenters after they have given their presentations. You can write questions in the question panel at any time during the presentations, and I encourage you to do so. We will answer as many of the questions as possible within the time remaining at the end of the webinar. So to get things started, I'd like to introduce Mike Flanagan with the University of Alberta to give us an introduction to wildfire risk in the Prairie provinces. Mike, over to you.
Thank you, Joellen. Can everyone see my screen? There we go. So hopefully you see the title slide, and that's a picture of Chuckade Creek fire from last year, where there's lots of fire in Alberta last year. What a difference a year makes, mainly because of the weather, maybe because of COVID as well. So as Joellen mentioned, I'm Mike Flanagan. I'm a professor at the University of Alberta and the scientific director of Canadian Partnership for Wildland Fire Science, or Canada Wildfire for short, because that's a real mouthful. Sorry, my slides are not advancing. I'm going to try this again. All right, so okay, so we've been keeping statistics on area burned back to about 1919, but they're really kind of incomplete till 1960 or 1970. On average, we burned 7,000 wildfires, burned 2 2.5 to 3 million hectares a year, about half the size of Nova Scotia. It's doubled since the 1970s, and I believe this is largely due to climate change. Fires in the boreal, often high intensity, high severity crown fires, but they're stand renewing, stand replacing. Area burned is highly episodic. This year has been very slow. It's been wet in a lot of areas, and so there's a lot of year-to-year variability. Lightning fires start 40 to 50% of the fires, depending what jurisdiction you're in, but they represent 80 to 90% of the area burned. Fire is all about the extremes. 3% of the fires in Canada, and they're over 200 hectares. A hectare is about the size of a football field or soccer pitch. They represent 97% of the area burned. And much of those happen on a few critical days of hot, dry, windy weather. So fire isn't just a problem in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta. It goes from sea to sea to sea. This is from the Canadian Forest Service, the National Fire Database, and shows polygons of fires by decade. And you can see that in the Prairie provinces, that boreal forest, and especially the boreal shield, there's lots and lots and lots of fire. So I forgot to mention, but I did look up on the CFC website, and on average, the three provinces, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, have about 2,300 fires on average in the last 10 years, and they burn just over 1 million hectares on average each year. Not this year so far. So this shows evacuations, and once again, we see it's from sea to sea to sea. So, you know, fire just isn't an Alberta or Saskatchewan or Manitoba problem. It's wherever there's something to burn, it will burn when the conditions are right. So briefly, fire management, and hopefully Larry will give us a little bit more. Canadian fire management agencies are among the best in the world. We use something called the Canadian Forest Fire Danger Rating System. I'm sure you've all seen the signs, or on the website, there's lots of information. Fire Weather Index System and the Fire Behavior Prediction System. And the Fire Weather Index System is, in fact, the de facto global standard for fire weather. It's used around the world. Fire management is challenging, okay? And it's becoming more challenging because there's increased demands on fire management, and the climate is changing. So what's also happening is that, you know, as more and more development takes place, and this is work done by a former student of mine, Lynn Johnston, and she's with the Canadian Forest Service, looking at the wildland urban interface, the industrial interface, and the infrastructure interface, and you can see there's a fair bit of development where people are, and it's kind of spreading north with time. So, you know, this is also what a reason for we're seeing more impactful fires, is because there's more values on the landscape. If the Fort McMurray fire had burned 100 years ago, it wouldn't have been the costliest natural disaster in Canadian history. But because there has been development, now, you know, fires bump into these. So simply put, you need 3 ingredients for fires to happen. The fuel, what type of fuel, how much fuel, how is it structured, and probably most importantly, how dry is that fuel? And then you need ignition, and we've already talked about people and lightning. Those are by far, you know, the common agents. Weather, hot, dry, windy weather. You can get away with just dry and windy, and in particular, extreme weather is really driving the fire business. I may be unabashedly biased. I think weather's, you need all 3, but I think weather's most important. Weather also influences the other 2 ingredients. Lightning is a function of the weather, and fuel moisture is largely a function of the weather as well. And once a fire is up and running, once you get ignition, it self-perpetuates and really depends on the weather. The fuel is much more static as opposed to the weather, which is dynamic and can change wind direction quite quickly, which can cause all sorts of problems. So Canada has been warming, okay? And this is from Canada's Changing Climate Report, Chapter 4. And Canada as a nation is warming at twice the rate of the rest of the world. And it seems to be more focused in the west and in the north. And these are observations. And what I'm going to tell you is the warmer we get, the more fire we see. And I'll talk a bit more in detail about that. So globally, this is monthly temperature anomalies for the globe. The last time the globe had a below normal month in terms of temperature compared to 1951 to 1980 was December 1984. And I actually remember that because it was quite cold in North America, December 84, and into January as well, but January didn't quite make the below zero. And you can see we're going up and up and up, and it's over 400 months. So we are seeing a trend. It is warming, and here's just an animation, and the blues are colder than normal, the yellows and oranges and reds are warmer than normal, and it goes from 1880, it's reconstructed. And you can see as we get in the late 70s, 80s, and 90s, it's a much warmer world we live in. So we use something called GCMs. When I started doing research in this topic many years ago, they were called general circulation models. Now we call them global climate models. Call them what you will, but they suggest warming up to 6 degrees Celsius by then 2100. Greatest increases, high latitudes, Canada, overland, and winter and spring, particularly when the Arctic Ocean becomes seasonally ice-free. And that can happen, as some people say, as early as 2030s, some people say 2050s. What's really important to fire is the projected increases in extreme weather. Back to these extremes: heat waves, droughts, floods, windstorms, ice storms, but in particular heat waves and windstorms. And of course, there's a lot of variability, okay? From year to year, month to month, and I'm going to tell you, I expect to see more fire in the future, but not every year, okay? Some years are going to be cooler, some years are going to be wetter, and we won't see fire activity, but on average, taking a 10-year average, we are seeing more fire, and I expect we'll continue to see more fire. So I mentioned temperature, and that the warmer we get, the more fire we see. And people ask me, well, why is that? And here I'm not talking about an individual fire, like the Chuckade Creek fire, the Fort Mac fire, which when wind becomes a very important player. Here I'm talking about over a larger area, like Alberta or Saskatchewan or Manitoba, over a month or a fire season. And so why is temperature so important? Longer fire seasons, and we're seeing that in Alberta. Officially, our fire season used to start April 1st. It now starts March 1st because on average, our fire season is starting earlier. In fact, in Alberta, we can have fires any time of the year. We've had fires in December, and December 97. I think December was our busiest fire month in 1997. It was a wet summer. We've had fires in February. We've had fires all year long. So longer fire seasons, more lightning. Work in the States has found that for every degree of warming, you get about a 12% increase in lightning. And I expect that will be similar for Canada. Generally speaking, more lightning means more fire. Now, the last reason is as it gets warmer, the atmosphere gets much more efficient at sucking moisture out of the fuel. So unless we see increases in precipitation to compensate for this drying effect from warming, our fuels will be drier. And this is critical. This is where, weather and fuel, the nexus, the intersection between the two. Drier fuels means it's easier for fires to start, easier for fires to spread. That means there's more fuel available to burn, which means it can be a higher intensity fire, which means it can be very difficult to impossible to extinguish if it gets large. So these are the reasons why temperature is so important. So this is work done by the National Assessment for Climate Change in the United States. It was released a couple of years ago, and this shows precipitation change. I talked about the warming. It said it needs, if we get increases in precipitation, well, then it can compensate for it. But it looks like if we look at the Prairie provinces, yellows are drier than normal, and the greens are more precipitate. If you look at the summer, which is the bottom left, we see it's supposed to be drier, okay, for the majority of Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta, especially the southern parts. In particular, there is a slight increase in precip in the northern regions, but work I've done earlier suggests for every degree of warming, you need about a 15% increase in precipitation. So it doesn't look like there's enough precip even in the northern regions to compensate. So, if this is accurate, and that's, you have to take that with a bit of salt or a lot of salt, it's going to be dry. So I'm going to try and keep on a tight time schedule here. Canada will have more extreme fire weather with longer fire seasons, increased fire intensity, more emissions, meaning fires are going to be difficult to impossible to extinguish, and more area burned. Means that we have to adapt and be prepared for more fire. And as I mentioned, not every year, but on average, we're going to see more fires. And I just have to look in Alberta the last 10 years. 2011 was Slave Lake, 2015 was a very active year, 2016 Fort McMurray, 2019 Chuckay Creek, and other McMillan Complex, etc. So, there you go, 4 bad fire years, and maybe by mid-century it'll be 5 or 6 bad fire years in a decade. Fire in society, the interactions will increase in the future as we have more and more development on the landscape and more fire. The bottom line is we have to learn to live with fire, okay? And the top picture on the right there is from Fort Mac, just above waterways in 2016 May. And if you look really closely, you can see new aspens popping up. And the other picture is where there was a fire right after a fire, and almost all the organic material was removed, and that's very slow to regenerate. So a lot of people make this possible, and here are some of the support we have. Our website's there, canadawildfire.org, and just this Wednesday, a new podcast on fire just came out from BC Edmonton, and if you can Google that or wherever you get your podcasts, shameless promotion, I co-hosted that with Adrian Lamb, so World on Fire. And there I will stop.
Great, thank you very much, Mike, for that overview. At this point in time, we're going to switch to looking more at the provincial level and turn the microphone over to Larry Fremont, who is going to present on how the province of Saskatchewan is working to mitigate their wildfire risks. Larry?
Okay, thank you. I'm just waiting for my presentation to pop up. All right. So today I'm going to talk about what we are doing now to manage wildfire risk and also projecting that into the future. So I'm going to talk a little bit, just touch on our wildfire pre-plan work, talk about wildfire risk assessments that we do, and focus a little bit more on the actual mitigation work that we're doing, and talk about how we fund that in a little bit more detail. And I will give you a couple of project examples so you can actually see what we're doing. So the pre-planning work, I always tell people we don't have to wait for smoke in the air to prepare for wildfire event. We pre-plan or develop pre-plans for communities, and that identifies, some of the key contacts. What are the resources required to protect communities? What are the priority values to protect? And description of surrounding fuels. So that if somebody goes in there, say an incident command team goes into a community and is tasked with protecting it, they already have, and this is just a snapshot of the overall pre-plan, but it gives you an idea that they're walking in not having to learn everything. So that certainly helps. Risk assessments, we do that upon request. We also review new development proposals. So if somebody wants to develop, say, a subdivision, we get those plans before they're ever developed so we can comment on them from a wildfire perspective. So the assessments we do range from individual home, industrial sites, and right up to community scale. And we always include mitigation recommendations in the assessments we do. And often that's followed up with presentations to the jurisdiction we're working with, or the owner. So we have two different assessments that we do. We have one that we've developed with our agency. It's kind of a all-encompassing, a little bit bigger version. And then the Fire Smart Canada Neighborhood Recognition Program, they have a version. You notice it's no longer Fire Smart Canada Community Recognition Program. It's now been changed to neighborhood. So we do those as well. Risk mitigation, we do a lot of forest thinning with the goal to reduce the intensity of wildfire so suppression personnel can effectively manage it. Mike talked about in the future there's going to be more fuel available to burn. We want to reverse that trend. We want to make these places safer for crews and residents. We want to make it more effective for aerial and ground suppression. Give them a better chance to be successful. So some examples, we do a lot of thinning using hand crews with a goal to reduce the amount of fuel and ideally to convert it. If you are working in a softwood stand with even a little bit of aspen content, once you open up those stands, you get those aspens to sucker up nicely, and it converts it to a 50-50 or even a hardwood dominant stand when you're done over the long term. We also do mechanical clearing or thinning. So we remove the fuels or reduce the fuels depending on what option we're taking. So a couple before and afters is black spruce stand, and that's that same stand looking from the inside back out. Everything's thinned, pruned out, deadfalls, everything's burnt on site. Anything suitable for firewood is left for locals. Here's another before and after shot. The after shot is the next spring, so it hasn't had a chance to fill in, but that's kind of a mixed wood stand. Softwood stand. And again, I want to emphasize that these aren't meant to stop a wildfire. They're meant to slow it down and allow suppression forces to be able to stop it before it gets into the community. This is the first fall after a project was done in the winter, mixed wood stand, and you can really see where the hardwoods are starting to sucker in once these stands are opened up. Before you could barely walk through the stand with all the softwood regen coming up. Where there's commercial timber, we take on mechanical fitting as an option. There is a subdivision along this whole south shore of this lake. And 17 years later, wildfire rolled in. We had done no maintenance. You can see the edge of the break, and you can see the fire runs into it. Once the fire got into it, it stayed on the ground. It didn't candle, didn't go up the trees. It certainly didn't crown. You can see where it was a lot easier to put a cat guard in that thinned area. It was a lot easier. A couple shots of Napatak. You'll be hearing from Pam about that community, but we work with them to build a guard, again, commercial timber that were removed. And this one just gives you a little better scale, how big it was. This is another removal, real high hazard fuels, jack pine with black spruce understory, taking it right down the mineral soil here. And top left, you can actually see that same guard. Far right, you can see where a fire started and blew it down into the lake river system, 90-degree switch in the wind, blew it right through an outfitting camp where it burnt most of the camp down and went right at the community of Black Lake. And that fire guard there protected that community. This is actually ice on the lake. You can see the date. This is Lake Athabasca, northern Saskatchewan. So this is expensive. We were able to apply and get funding through Disaster Mitigation and Adaptation Fund, and we're doing probably around 85 to 90 communities. We're year 2 of a 9-year program with over $33 million combined. As for thinning, fire guard construction and maintenance, and that allows us to do work on Crown, municipal, and on power line right-of-ways. It's 50-50 split on Crown land. The feds will pay 75% if it's on Indigenous land, and 40% if it's on municipal land that isn't Indigenous. Cliff will talk about this a little bit more, but we also have a really good arrangement with Indigenous Services Canada to do work there as well. So I'm not going to dwell on that one. We do case studies on all of our fire incidents that either start within or burn into our fuel management sites. And if anybody wants to see that, there's the link. And I think my time is up. So I will handle questions at the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Larry. We had, I'm going to mix it up a bit, and there was one question, it's a short question that perhaps you could answer right now, which is when you're doing the thinning, following the thinning, do you get much wind throw?
We're very careful about that. We realize that if you open it up too much, or if you open it up on a wet site, or too close to a lake or other large opening, that we will get wind through. So we make a point of leaving some edges or staying away from the edges of the lakes and wet areas. So yeah, we get some, but also in the stands, untreated stands next to them, we're getting wind throw coming through. So we haven't had a large scale wind event in a fuel break that hasn't occurred at the same time in an untreated. You know, we've had major wind scale or wind events come through that flattened everything, but it didn't matter whether it was within the break or not. So we are aware of that risk, and we take all precautions to make sure that we prevent it.
Great. Thank you, Larry. So as mentioned, we're now going to move to two presentations, also within the focus on wildfire risk management in Saskatchewan. We're going to begin with Cliff Buettner from the Saskatchewan First Nations Emergency Management Wildfire Protection Services, and who's also responsible for their Community Fire Smart program. The second presenter is Pam Sanderson, who will be sharing the Community of Napatak's Fire Smart approach. So at this point in time, I'm welcome Cliff to begin his presentation.
I'm not bringing my screen up here, so I'm not sure what's...
Cliff, if you just open your PowerPoint presentation, I can see your screen right now. So it should come up on the screen when the presentation is opened.
Not sure where I'm going here.
No problem.
I do have a copy here if I can get it up. So, is it showing up?
No, you're opening your web browser. If you open your PowerPoint, there you go.
So this PowerPoint?
Yep.
I'm there.
It's a little slow on my end, but it's coming through now. There you go.
Okay. I work quite closely with Larry Fremont, and my background is in wildfire management, where I was employed for 14 years, and I've been with the Prince Albert Grand Council as a director, just recently appointed as a director of Forestry and Emergency Protective Services. So I want to talk a bit about the Grand Council and what we do internally and how we work with other agencies in fire risk reduction. So I want to talk a bit about Saskatchewan, or the Prince Albert Grand Council, and our First Nations Wildfire Protection Services agreements that we have. some of the community fuel hazard reduction programs that we work closely with Saskatchewan Public Safety Agency. I want to talk a bit about the Prairie Interagency Prescribed Fire Initiative, the PAGC Wildfire Task Force, and then some discussion about the Saskatchewan First Nations Emergency Management Program that we have within the Grand Council. Prince Albert Grand Council are 12 First Nations that are part of our organization that represent approximately 40,000 people. We're divided into 4 distinct sectors: the Athabasca area with 3 Denisoulini communities, the eastern sector, what we call Swampy Cree, 3 First Nations, the southern James Smith Cree Nation, Sturgeon Lake Cree Nation, and Wapayton would be one of our Dakota nations, and the Woodland Cree, Lac La Ronge, Montreal Lake, and Peter Ballantyne Cree Nation. That's our organization, or who we represent. Saskatchewan First Nations Wildfire Protection Services Agreement in 1992. This service agreement was the first agreement of its kind in Canada to provide fire crews for fire prevention and suppression, signed by the federal and provincial governments and 22 First Nations in Saskatchewan. So letters of understanding were signed by the Prince Albert Grand Council. We currently have 35 sustained action fire crews within our communities. Meadow Lake Tribal Council, I believe, has 18. Agency Chiefs Tribal Council, I think, has 2. And Big River First Nation, who was part of Agency Chiefs, has just went independent, similar to Beardy's and Okamasas Cree Nation. What are we concerned about? Urban interface. One of the issues that we're dealing with right now is in respect to evacuations and the COVID situation. So we've kind of been hit with that already this spring in the English fire in Fort LaCorne, where we were trying to evacuate some Priority 1 people out of James Smith Cree Nation. That was quite concerning in terms of where do you take people. We do have conference calls coming up next week in respect to that same situation, I guess, if it comes up in the fall. How do we evacuate people? Where do we evacuate them to under the current situation that we're dealing with? Fuel hazard reduction work. Larry had mentioned the Disaster Mitigation Adaptation Fund. And this is one of the crews that we were fortunate, I guess, we applied through public tenders for those contracts, and we also do community fuel hazard reduction on reserve, funded through Indigenous Services Canada. So this is one of my crews that I used for some of the work for the Disaster Mitigation Adaptation Fund. This guy and his crew, he's been doing this type of work on reserve or for contract work for the last 4 or 5 years for Prince Albert Grand Council. They're all Woodland Cree. They all grew up in the bush, and they're all pretty good workers when it comes to doing this type of fuel hazard reduction work. This is some of the work that we were doing at Candle Lake, and it's just, again, before and after shot in terms of the amount of fuel loading that was there and how we're trying to reduce the fuel adjacent to the infrastructures within our recreational subdivisions or our communities. This is an example of a community fuel management plan. So the province, under the Emergency Management Assistance Program, by priorities, we've identified communities at risk. The community fuel management plans are developed by the Saskatchewan Public Safety Agency. And once they're endorsed by the community, we hire people from the community and we implement the work that's required. So this is a progressive work that we've done in the community of South End, which is one of 19 communities that we've worked in over the last 5 years. Another aspect of what we're looking at, and we've actually developed this through Northern Lights School Division, Cumberland House and La Ronge, who have participated, where it's actually a high school credit for what they call Iskotew, it's fire response. So we're actually taking people in grade 10, grade 11, and we're training them and in terms of prescribed fire or control burning. And fire can be a healer and a helper, not necessarily a foe. And there's opportunity for us, and we deal more with prevention and education. And if it means control burning, and that's how we protect our community, that's what we want people to understand. Fire can be a benefit when you're actually fighting a fire. the Prairie Interagency Prescribed Fire Initiative, it's a concept paper was submitted to the W. Garfield Weston Foundation. It was initiated by the Nature Conservancy of Canada with a lot of partnerships, I guess, Environment Canada, Grasslands National Park, Washington Valley Authority, Prince Albert Grand Council. We are part of it because of our sustained action fire personnel. So we're a support to this prescribed fire endeavor. We do a lot of work with our communities for ground ignition and fuel hazard reduction work. So it's a collaboration between multiple agencies and First Nations to provide education and training opportunities for on-the-ground delivery of prescribed fire. The intent is to standardize training, planning, and execution of prescribed fire. So we're kind of all in this, working in it together as a multi-agency across multiple jurisdictions. In 2017, it was a bad fire season, the northeast side of Saskatchewan, and Chief Peter Beattie with Peter Ballantyne Cree Nation presented a resolution to the Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations in Saskatchewan to develop a wildfire task force. And the intent of that was to have more First Nations involvement in decision making and using traditional knowledge. A lot of First Nations people have historic experience with suppression of fires, and we wanted to maintain that. So we do still train and qualify emergency fire personnel that are an additional resource to the Saskatchewan Public Safety Agency, besides the initial attack personnel or sustained action personnel that we have under contract. Our First Nations emergency management, I currently have, I think, 11 employees that I've taken under my wing, primarily dealing with structural fire training and inspections. We've been fortunate through Firefighters Without Borders, where a lot of our First Nations had no turnout gear, no fire trucks. They have volunteer departments, but we don't really have the equipment required. So we've actually picked up quite a bit of turnout gear, fire trucks, and the staff here with our training officers also service those trucks and help train volunteer departments in utilizing that equipment. Through Indigenous Services Canada, we realized that the volunteer departments that we have do not really have any ability to deal with grass fires or brush fires or whatever. So the Wildland Equipment Program is basically providing all First Nations within Saskatchewan that have a volunteer department with basic training gear, PPE, so that they have coveralls, boots, not turnout gear to try to attempt to attack a grass fire, as well as leaf blowers, backpacks, McLeod tools, shovels, and drip torches. So at least they have some ability to respond to grass fires within their community. A good example is Kinniston First Nation. We just did our first rollout of this equipment program for all the Southern First Nations 2 days later at a grass fire, and used that equipment to save a house from burning down on their reserve. Actually, this week we're down in Cody First Nation, who were one of the first First Nations, I guess, in Canada to receive or to get a wildfire awareness grant, and they had a little presentation there about a week and a half ago. We're actually in Cody this week doing wildland fire certification training for their volunteer fire department. We're also capable of doing search and rescue here through our office. We have a communications officer, search and rescue, an associate director, Michelle Vandervoort, and she's also, I think, on the Fire Smart Canada board of directors now. So, in conclusion, we're Fire Smart and Fire Smart Canada community recognition or neighborhood recognition programs. So we've been implementing that on First Nations. A big component of what we do is education and partnerships for First Nations, research and community-based climate change initiatives. So that would be my presentation.
Great, thank you very much, Cliff.
Thank you.
I thought that was a very interesting presentation. And there's going to be some follow-up questions for you afterwards, I'm sure.
Okay, thank you.
The next presentation that we have is going to be from Pam Sanderson with the community of Napatak, who, as mentioned before, has been engaged in the Fire Smart program. So we just load up Pam's presentation and I could turn it over to you.
I don't know how.
Hi, Pam. So are you able to click the share your screen button on your GoTo webinar panel?
Oh, go to, okay. I'm on the side, I have the control panel up. Where, yep. Okay, so where do I go?
There should
on
be
this panel?
A square box there that has a icon of a screen there. And if you click that, you can share your screen.
So change presenter, it says?
Yep.
Okay. Is it working?
Not yet, no. So I will send you another invite there, Pam, to share your screen. So you should get a little pop-up box.
Okay. Okay, I have to click that. What? Okay. Will not be able to record the content of your screen until it is quit. It says GoToMeeting will not be able to record the content of your screen until it is quit. Later. Quit.
Yeah, if you
what?
Close that.
Okay, close this. All right. It's okay. It's not allowing me to do that. It says later or quit now. That's what it says. The choices. Hang on, if I just.
Maybe, Pam, what you can do is if you email me your presentation, I can share it on my screen.
Okay.
Joellen,
I could take a few questions.
Yes, that's
okay.
what I was going to suggest.
Okay.
Great, thank you.
Does that work?
Yeah. So while we are engaging solving our technical issue here, we're just going to go back perhaps, and I have a question for Mike that was raised by Stephen Carr. So Mike, based upon the information that you presented, is there a strong argument for more aggressive fire smarting in communities in the higher risk zones like the boreal forest?
I think Larry and Cliff can also chime in as well. I think one thing we can do is all human-caused fires are preventable. And I think overall we do a pretty good job. And, I showed that there's more area burned now than in the past. And this is largely because there's more large lightning fires. Our human-caused fires have been going down, and this is good, but we can do even better by preventing them. We use fire bans, and sometimes we should use forest closures. Fire Smart is a great program, and every community should have an emergency management plan for fire, for flood, etc., for evacuation, etc. But by doing Fire Smart, it reduces the risk of that community town being burnt to the ground. Okay, so anything we can do to reduce that risk, we'll never be able to eliminate it. And there's another thing we can consider is community shelters. Okay, having a place with good air, because smoke is often one of the reasons for evacuation. Sometimes the fire is many kilometers from town, but you get smoked out, and people with respiratory issues have to be evacuated unless you have a clean air shelter, which could also serve as a fire shelter. It costs money, but evacuation is a fairly traumatic event for many people. So, you know, if I was given the choice, I'd prefer to stay if there was a safe place, okay? If it's not safe, you have to leave. So sorry for such a long answer. Hopefully we got our technical things sorted, and maybe Larry and Cliff have something to add to that. But yes, I'm fully supportive of fire smart activities.
Larry or Cliff?
Yeah, Larry here. I can add to that. I guess important to note that there's been fires here forever, and we are building and moving into the fire environment, and it's up to us to take the steps to make those developments fire resilient. The problem with that, it's easy to say, it's not so easy to do, especially because of the cost associated with it. So hopefully in the future there'll be more funding for all jurisdictions to do this kind of work. But in the meantime, I know Saskatchewan West has a fair amount of funding for mitigation work, and I believe that's only going to grow to support the other jurisdictions.
Please try again later. Oh my God.
Thank you. I'm sensing that our next presentation is not quite ready to go. So if there's no
It's
further,
coming. It's loading.
okay. Perhaps what I will do is ask the next question, which is also for you, Mike. It seems like most wildfire risk indices are based upon forest fires, but are there equivalents for prairie grass fires? And have those yet been calculated for future scenarios?
So our fire weather index system was developed in the Ottawa Valley primarily in red pine and jack pine, and was designed for the forest. But with the fire behavior prediction system, it does work for grasslands, and there is grass components and type of grass, and there's a new grass module as well. We expect grass fires to increase in the future, and we've seen some really bad ones in Alberta recently, and well into the fall. And some of you may remember the Granham fire, which spread 60 kilometers during winter. Started from a burning barrel that blew over in kind of like Chinook winds. So there's power line problems with strong winds that start fires, and we're seeing stronger and stronger winds. So yeah, I expect more grass fires where we have grass. Okay, a lot of the agricultural land, you know, strip farming, and so spreading of fires is more difficult in those situations, or irrigation. But yes, fire weather index system does work with grass, and for predicting fire behavior, there's grass modules as well. And we expect it to increase as well in the future.
Okay.
As well as
I don't know that it will load though. It says, please try again later. It keeps. I don't know what else to do.
Sorry, I need to unmute myself. Thank you, Mike, for providing that input. I know that there's quite a lot of interest in the changing fire risk related to grasslands. At this point in time, I've heard from Cam that we are going to move on to the presentation by Shauna. So I just need to have Cam will help Shauna load her presentation up at this point in time. So as mentioned before, Shauna Courts is with the City of Thompson in Manitoba, and she's responsible for their community wildfire protection plan. So Shauna, I'm hoping that you'll be able to make your presentation now.
Thanks. I'm just can you see my screen?
It was up there, Shauna, but it has since gone. So if you reshare your screen.
Oh, okay. Share my screen.
There you go.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so you can see my screen now?
Yes, thank you.
All right, just a small correction there. I'm actually with the Manitoba government. I work for the Manitoba Wildfire Service. I am the fire control officer based in Thompson, and it was a collaborative effort with the Community Wildfire Protection Plan. So what I'm going to talk to you today is the Community Wildfire Protection Plan that was done with the City of Thompson. I'm going to talk about some of the past work that was done in the city of Thompson Community Wildfire Protection Plan, the preparedness part of it, and the mitigation plans that have been put together.
Connection is always
So just some background. City of Thompson is 750 kilometers north of Winnipeg. We have a population here of about 13,300 people. It is the hub of the north. We service all the outlying communities. There's one single lane highway in and out, and our main industries here are hydro and valley nickel mining. Just a little background. Again, we are in the heart of the boreal forest in Thompson. The city, they began implementing Fire Smart principles long before we called it Fire Smart in the city of, or in the province of Manitoba. We're not quite as far ahead as Alberta and Saskatchewan, but we're working on it. Basically, it started with the regional foresters recognizing that there's a need for the fuel reduction within the old growth forests and the risk of fires within the city. And then the city got on board with the work, and in 2005 we began planning and implementing a brushing program. So the original brushing project started with the use of the initial attack firefighter crews that are based at my Helitack base south of Thompson, and then the city bought a small brusher, and they started doing the maintenance every 3 to 4 years in behind what the crews had brushed and pruned. So this is just a snapshot of some of our pre-treatment fuel loads, a lot of C2, and then we've got some C2 mixed deciduous. So this is kind of what our pre-treatments look like. And then many of the areas have, since the brushing has been done and mulching, we've kind of gone to a stand conversion where we're now converted these areas into a deciduous forest.
Where does the PDF format? Okay.
Fast forward, we sat down with the same foresters and myself, fire control officer, the City of Thompson fire chief and deputy fire chief, and sat down and literally had a backyard meeting looking at the wildland urban interface in Thompson and said, we need to do something. There's, we're going to end up with a Slave Lake or a Kamloops or Fort McMurray. And we recognize that, this could happen in Thompson, and we need an official plan in place and need to deal with this. So we brought the stakeholders together, which was Hydro, Valley, RCMP, First Nations, MTS, etc., and started developing the plan within the city. We are surrounded by old growth C2 fuel. We have been threatened by a large fire in the past. If you look at the wildfire incident map that I have up, you can see that red large fire. We were just lucky that the winds were directly out of the south and stayed directly out of the south. Otherwise, it could have been a disaster for the city. So we sat down and started working on the preparedness plan. And in the preparedness plan, we looked at the critical infrastructure, hydro, bridges, water treatment plants, hospitals. We looked at the hazardous values, which is hydro, again, gas stations, fuel farms. We took into consideration our special values, churches, cemeteries, schools, and then you've got your houses and other businesses. We're lucky that Valet, which is a very large operation, has their own emergency plan, and they are covered so that we don't have to worry about them in the event of a fire. Doesn't take up more of our resources. With the plan, we looked at fire operations, so our functional roles, evacuations, operations, structural protection, our mutual aid, communications, and how we're going to communicate with everyone. We put together a minimum auto order list, which was the equipment that we're going to need for each zone within the city in the event that houses are threatened. So what sprinklers, what pumps, and basically the table on the right is our minimum structure protection auto order list. Another part of the preparedness plan was our sprinkler plans, and the OFC, Office of the Fire Commissioner in Manitoba, developed an app for building our sprinkler plans. And if you see on the map, it's a 1 kilometer grid, and we've used it for all other CWPPs that we developed in the province. Another part of the preparedness plan was evacuation. The City of Thompson has an emergency management plan. We basically details communication process, procedures for evacuations. We've talked to the fuel companies about staging Bowsers outside of the city in the event that we do have to evacuate. And then we've also got our safe refuge areas, which we identified within the city. So our malls, where we have the large parking lots. And we have a shelter in place location, which is our Thompson Regional Community Center. So again, it's a large enough building to house people with proper ventilation. So we've identified that in our plans. Emergency contact lists, and again, that goes into communication, all our stakeholders, RCMP, EMO. We've looked at tactical lines, identified locations for indirect and direct attack, and access locations. And then the second part of the plan is our mitigation strategy. So we use the FireSmart standards for vegetation management. So again, fuel removal, reduction, and species conversion. Part of this was to introduce an enhanced fuel wood permitting program to the residents of Thompson. So on the map, we identified areas that we would send people to go and cut firewood. Permits are free within the city, and each year we look at the map and designate the new areas. Another part of the mitigation strategy was to have the forestry company put cut blocks into the plan north of the city. It's in their harvest plan for 2017 to 2019. Realistically, we don't think it would be harvested because of the distance to the mill, but maybe we can open it up for fuel wood. But that's more of a landscape level strategy. Again, last year within the city, we brought in our fire crews again and did thinning and pruning. We picked a high profile area right along the main strip where we can put up a FireSmart demonstration sign and show the public this is what FireSmart looks like. And we'll again do that this year. And then the City of Thompson actually did a large area where they did kind of a stand, call it a partial stand conversion, where they cut and mulched, and you can see mostly aspen within these stands now. The maintenance program, again, the City of Thompson will go in and every couple of years they will rebrush these areas that we look at, and we'll set the priorities for any fuel wood permitting. Another part of the plan is cross-training, and we worked very closely with Thompson Fire Emergency Services, the Wildfire Service, and the OFC, doing structural wildland training for structural firefighters, working with Manitoba water bomber presentations. We've got planned sandbox exercises, mock exercises, pump and hose training, and incident command training. So working very closely and building a strong tie with the different agencies. Another part of the plan was the education and communication. We want to make sure that we get it out to the public. So spring preparedness meetings, we went to trade shows, fire smart displays, presentations to council, and participated in other events within the community. And then we put together an implementation plan, which is, this is our short-term goals of what we want to accomplish for the 2020 season. Again, working closely with trying to get more of the city to do more brushing, pruning, etc. And that is pretty much the plan that we put together. Again, Mike Flanagan said we need to adapt and be prepared, and I think that's what this has done for the city of Thompson and the people in the north here. Thanks.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Shauna, for telling us all about what's going on in Thompson. I have received a note from Cameron to let me know that unfortunately we have lost Pam Sanderson, and she's not going to be able to present at the webinar today. We seem to have a internet connectivity concern. So we are going to move on now to the question and answer section of the webinar. I know that obviously some of you have already asked some questions and posted them in the question box. If there are anyone else would also like to add some additional questions into the box, or send us some additional questions, that'd be great.
Yeah.
And we'll go.
What happened was
so the questions, there are some other questions that have yet to be raised. So Marty Alexander, so Cliff, Marty Alexander has asked whether or not all of the First Nation communities that the Grand Council is serving, do they have a fire weather station? Cliff, are you able to answer that question?
Sorry, I didn't hear that question.
Sorry. I was just wondering whether or not all of the First Nation communities that you are serving have a fire weather station.
It would be under the provincial grid system, so the individual communities are First Nations, so they would use the fire weather information off of their remote sites. I just got tied up in a bit of a conversation here over some flooding in Meadow Lake Tribal Council area, so our emergency response and some of the other things that we're dealing with as we speak here. But do we use the weather information from the provincial weather sites?
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
And Shauna, the question has been asked for you in terms of how wide is the fire break around Thompson?
We actually haven't done a fire break around the city. It's something that has been discussed. We would have to look for funding. And I guess my question was going to be to Larry, how large is the fire break that he had in his presentation? We're just debating on how we go about this and money that we would need to do it. And so I'm just wondering what size of fire break Larry put in.
You're going to have to go into our case studies and look at it. But in general, to respond to that, for a high hazard softwood stand, we like to go at least 200 meters. So that's kind of the maximum we go out, and then we'll widen roadways up to 50 meters, 75 meters. It really depends on the stand. And this funding that we have is over a long range period, so we keep building on existing to make them better and better, wider. But rule of thumb for me is 200 meters for a high risk stand, and probably at least 75 meters for a mixed wood stand.
Great. Thank you. In terms of any additional questions, I was just wondering myself, you know, at the beginning of the presentation, we had Mike was presenting on how the climate risk is going to be changing going forward. And we have a lot of very strong positive action that's taking place on the ground now. And I was wondering if any of the speakers would be able to say about what are you most concerned about in terms of the changing fire risk, and what investments you think are needed in order to address those, building on the good work that's already being done right today.
It's Larry here. I can take a crack at that. What I would really like to see is for residents and communities to step up and take on as much responsibility for their own properties, their own jurisdiction, as we are trying to do for the crown land that surrounds them. We can't go on to private land to do the work, and often cases, you know, we talked about how wide a break should be or a thinning project. You're still going to get a heavy shower of embers coming across, and if those individual properties are in a state where a collection of embers will start new fires, then we haven't gained too much. So that's what I would like to see. I would like to see the general public take on the same interest as we are to reduce the risk of wildfire.
Thank you. Shauna or Cliff, is there anything that you'd like to add to that?
I can respond in respect to the work that we've done, Larry and I, through the SPSA and our relationship at the education prevention. So a lot of work that we've done over the last 5 years is prevention exercises or mitigation in the anticipation that we will have more severe fires in the future.
Good. There are a couple of other questions now. Stephen Carr is wondering whether or not any of the presenters think that it would be good to see provincial or municipal authorities enhancing building code standards, especially for new builds, to improve fire resiliency.
Larry here again. I'll take that crack on. By all means, that is a needed step, and I can tell you that Fire Smart Canada is working with the NFPA to develop a wildland urban interface code. I think they have a rough draft in place right now. The whole code process is very formalized, and it's going to take a little time to come out. But that is something that we really recommend that community planners take on, so that, again, people take on the steps that they need to do for their own jurisdictions to reduce the risk for existing and any new developments. So definitely, yes.
Great. Thank you, Larry. And then we have a final question from Anna Dubrovnik. I'm wondering if any of the speakers have noticed how much public support has increased for action on dealing with fires and living with fires. Is there any research to support that there has been a change in the level of public support for taking action on fire? And what do you think is the most important steps towards increasing public awareness? about the need for this type of action.
Larry here again, if kind of represents Saskatchewan here, so I can tell you when I started doing this in 2000, it was a bit of a project to educate the community group that you're working with, explain why you're doing the work, what you'll be doing, you know, everything to get them on board, and backed by all the fire imagery that we see on TV from Australia, the States, Alberta, even internally here. In 2015, we had a ridiculous fire season. Now it is really easy. People are coming to us asking for these projects. There's no more convincing involved. There's no question that people are better informed about wildfire risk. They actually want to see this work done, and it has definitely changed. Attitudes have changed.
So Mike Flanagan here. I agree completely with that. And education is a key. The more the public's informed about wildfire, the more informed decisions we can make moving forward. And I would like to address the second last question. Governance is a really big problem. Some of the things are controlled by the province. Some of the things are like building codes. Some of them are controlled by the municipality, you know, subdivision planning, and there needs to be standardization. Insurance industries are sending out guidelines and may use that for premiums and how much you pay, or if you get covered or not. Also, the National Research Council is sending out a technical guide in wildland urban interface. So there's a lot of information coming or already out there. Of course, you know, the Fire Smart program's been around for years, Partners in Protection before the Fire Smart, but the governance issue is a real sticky wicket, and it's something that we need to solve because we need to be all on the same page.
Great.
Just on that last question there about the public and the interest and I find here in Thompson that when it's wet, like it is this spring, the concern isn't quite there. It's once we start getting hot and dry again that people start getting a little bit more concerned about the fires and the fire safety. And it's this time of year when it's slow for us. That's when we should be getting the work done. And I think that's a challenge, engaging the people when the risk isn't there for them.
Okay. Thank you. Actually, just a bit of building on the governance comment by Mike, there is a final question around, given that wildfire is a transboundary issue, how is it that municipalities are coordinating efforts to foster collaboration? So perhaps, Shauna, is there any collaboration between Thompson and other communities that, around Thompson on this issue? Or Larry within the, Cliff within the Grand Council?
Yeah, in the north here, I have worked with a few of the First Nation communities, and we've done presentations to get them engaged in starting to look at Fire Smart and what needs to be done in the communities. I'm also working with the town of Gillam, which is about 3 hours northeast of here, and we're in the process of putting together their CWPP right now. So we have engaged the other communities in the north, and I know my Fire Smart counterpart in the south has done the same.
Thank you. Okay. Good. Is there any final comments that any of the presenters would like to make?
Just a discussion or a comment, I guess, in terms of our emergency response coordinators and all the First Nations and Indigenous Services Canada, and maybe it's reflective of the COVID situation. but we've seemed to have built up a fairly big network within all of our First Nations in Saskatchewan through Firefighters Without Borders, and by acquiring equipment on First Nations, we do have mutual aid agreements with other fire, volunteer, rural, or municipal fire departments, and we want to, I guess, provide the same service through the First Nations, where if we have the capacity within the First Nation to respond to, or to assist the municipalities, that's the direction we're going.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I guess at this time, I'd like to bring this webinar to a close. I'd like to thank everyone for attending the webinar, and particularly for our presenters today, Mike, Larry, Cliff, and Shauna. I'd also like to send in a thank you out to Cameron for managing everything on the back end of today and getting the presentations aligned as much as possible. We have recorded today's webinar, and we'll be posting it along with the presentations from today's webinar on the Prac website. And that will include, we will reach out to Pamela and see whether or not we can also include her presentation that she was unable to make today on our website. There will be a short evaluation survey circulated at the end, and we'd very much appreciate it if you could fill out the survey so that we can get some feedback, not only in terms of the presentation today, but also in terms of other presentations that you would like to see the Prac undertake. We will be hosting at least 3 more workshops or 3 more webinars over the rest of this fiscal year. And so we're always looking for ideas for what it is that you would like to see explored in these webinars. So with that, I will bring this event to a close. Thank you very much for attending, and we look forward to having you participate in the next webinar. Thank you.